What's up, YouTube? This is 82 and 0. Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about, in my opinion, the original Bad Boy Piston. His name was Walter Dukes. Now, he was born in 1930. He grew up in Rochester, New York. Born June 23rd, 1930. And he would go to East High School in Rochester, New York. And he wasn't just a basketball star in high school. He was also a track and field athlete, which is something you saw with Russell and you saw with Chamberlain. And some people consider Walter Dukes to be the first really athletic 7-footer. I would agree. He had a really high vertical. I'm not sure what his vertical would be measured at, but I do know that he was an amazing track and field athlete. And I think what most people who know of him or know him, they more so remember him for his Seton Hall career. It wasn't so much his NBA career, unfortunately. And unfortunately, he wasn't inducted into the Hall of Fame, which to me is a travesty. A lot of these players are never going to get in the Hall of Fame. And it's weird because you'll see some players who make the Hall of Fame who don't deserve it over these other players. But that's a topic for another day. But like I said, when he was a track athlete in his freshman year at Seton Hall, he ran a 1:58 half mile and anchored the winning Seton Hall mile relay team and the Penn Relays. Don't know what his vertical was. I'd love to know. So anyways, at Seton Hall, I think his best season in Seton Hall where it was the 52-53 season where he averaged 26 points per game, and he was chosen to be an All-American, and he led his team to 27 straight wins and the NIT tournament championship. But despite how good of a collegiate player he was drafted as the territorial pick in the 1953 draft of the NBA New York Knicks. Now, for those of you who don't know, the territorial pick means back then the NBA wasn't as popular as collegiate basketball. The college game was more stable. You know, a lot of people saw the NBA as, it might not last. Because prior to the NBA, you had all these other basketball leagues all over the country. So don't look at it in the lens of a 2023 fan. Look at it from somebody playing back then, right? Imagine you're Walter Dukes, right? And you don't know if the NBA is going to be around that long, so you got to make some money, right? So he, rather than playing with the Knicks right away, he chose to play with the Harlem Globetrotters instead. Our Harlem Globetrotters offered him a lot more money, one, and two, he liked the idea of getting to travel around the world. Because had he played in the NBA, he would only be traveling inside the USA. The Globetrotters traveled all over the world. But after 2 years with the Harlem Globetrotters, Dukes would eventually settle for the lower contract with the Knicks, and he played one season with the Knicks, although he suffered a knee injury, and he didn't make an initial impact on that Knicks team. That Knicks team was pretty good in the early 50s. They made 3 finals appearances, lost all 3, but Dukes was not somebody they wanted to invest in, and they got rid of him. So he'd be traded to the Minneapolis Lakers. Now, he was traded for Slater Martin, who was a Hall of Famer. He didn't play very long with the Lakers either. But, you know, those first two franchises didn't give him a chance. But his numbers were going up. Like in Minneapolis, for example, he got up to 11 rebounds per game. So this is kind of where I start to tell you why I consider him the original Bad Boy Piston. He played very similar. Okay, hear me out. To like a Dennis Rodman. He was a great rebounder, right? Wasn't the best shot blocker. One thing about him is he suffered from poor eyesight, and his hands were considered very weak. So he wasn't very good at shot blocking as other centers were, which is similar to Dennis Rodman. But he was an elite defensive rebounder. He was great at transition defense. He was an intimidator on the defensive end. He was an imposing force. His official rookie weight was 220, but if I remember right, he got up to like 250, in the NBA. He lifted his weights, is what I'm trying to say. But anyways, in Detroit, that's where he'd have his breakout career. He'd make 2 All-Star appearances in 60 and 61. His best season was in 60, where he put up 15 points and 13 rebounds. Like I said, it wasn't as good of a player as a Russell or a Chamberlain, but he was definitely great. So why isn't he as remembered? Well, I think a lot of the reason why he had trouble staying on teams is, he had his flaws, obviously. Like I mentioned, his poor eyesight, his hands. But the Pistons team were able to look past a lot of that. And unfortunately, Walter Dukes wasn't always the most professional. This is why I say he's a bad boy Piston. He was notorious for being a very dirty player. But he also got a lot of respect from his peers. One of them being St. Louis Hawks' Bob Pettit. He said, "I have the greatest respect for him. He had tremendous desire and works as hard as anyone. I know he's a terrific rebounder and about as good as anyone that's come on the defensive end." But when he was traded to Detroit in 1957, George Yardley, who is the Pistons' best scorer, said, "Now I won't have to worry about going out there and running into Dukes 5 or 6 games a season." So that Pistons team had a lot of promise. I mean, they had Yardley, Don Ohl. Later they had Bailey Howell, guys like that. But like I said, him being a dirty player, he fouled out a lot of the games. Yeah, one player he reminds me of, too, is Rasheed Wallace. He got a lot of technicals. Well, I don't want to use the term technical because technical fouls didn't exist. What I meant is he got thrown out of a lot of games. That's a better term to use. So, to give you an example of how dirty of a player he was, for his career, he averaged 4.1 fouls per game, right? Think about that. 4.1 fouls per game. That's almost fouling out, Because, 6 fouls, you foul out, And one of the things that I read about him and watched from him from the film is he was notorious for throwing elbows when he would go up for rebounds. That reminds me of, Dennis Rodman. He would frequently get into it with Bill Russell. And he would frequently get into it with referees. He didn't like a lot of the calls that went against him, kind of like Dennis Rodman. But, these Pistons teams, they weren't good enough to win. They didn't have a free agency back then, and you can't overthrow the Celtics or the Lakers, or they just weren't up to par. So check this out, right? He had 5,863 rebounds with the Pistons. That was his greatest asset, was his defensive rebounding ability. Anyways, he just went on a slow, or fast decline with the Pistons. By the 63 season, at just the age of 32, he had regressed down to 4.3 points per game and 5.8 rebounds per game. Part of the reason why I think his game declined so rapidly was his knee injuries that he had. Like, he had some pretty nasty knee injuries. But also, I think a lot of it, too, was his minutes were being reduced because of, like I said, his foul trouble. From what I read, they would take him out of games so much because he would just be a liability on the defensive end. Or he'd be such a liability on the defensive end at the end of games, because when you're having 4 or 5 fouls, you got to be really careful. And so he didn't want to foul out, and they would put him on the bench a lot of the times. He was also very sporadic in his behavior, kind of like Dennis Rodman. I know I keep comparing him to him, but he's the original bad boy Piston. In 1958, for example, the Pistons had scheduled an exhibition game in nearby Lansing, and team members were asked to drive their own cars. All the Piston players except Duke showed up. Red Rocha, the coach of the Pistons, was not especially disturbed at first, since Dukes rarely arrives on time. And everything I read about Dukes is he liked to sleep in. Similar to Allen Iverson, man. He didn't like to show up to practices. Yeah, he'd stay up late and then sleep all day. But anyways, he said they called the Michigan State Police and said, if you see a 7-foot basketball player, please bring him back to Lansing so he can play the game. That's what he said to the police. Now, Dukes, however, was nowhere between Detroit and Lansing. He had originally driven to Flint, where he found Flint area to be dark, and he assumed the game has canceled and drove back to Detroit. So, just sporadic behavior. Another example was the next year, Dukes failed to make it to the Detroit for his preseason physical exam. He already had signed a contract and had been sent a schedule for training period. The Pistons management couldn't understand his absence. The club called his residence and business office in New York City, his mother in Rochester, his sister in Elizabeth, New Jersey. The Pistons enriched a phone bill of over $200 trying to get a hold of him. 10 days later, they received a call from New York. Said, I understand you've been trying to call me, Duke said. And the Pistons said, where have you been? You're supposed to report to us 10 days ago. And then he reportedly said, gosh, you mean it's time to play basketball again? Where did the summer go? So, he liked to party, man. He liked moving at his own speed. Wasn't that's why I compare him to Rodman so much. So to give you another example, when at last he reported he traveled with the Pistons to Minneapolis for an exhibition game, he had not yet signed his contract, but no trouble was expected. He played the game pretty subpar, really below his level. And then he flew back to New York, leaving behind the no contract, no play etiquette. He missed the first 7 league games while he held a distant negotiation with the club. So he kind of pissed off the owner of the Pistons and coach. But I don't want to talk about all the negative. I want to talk about how good of a player he was. And I also want to talk about his life off of the court. Um, One thing that I've really read into him was, for example, after high school, he was originally supposed to play in Louisville, but he decided to go to Seton Hall because of the Jim Crow laws that were down south, right? And this really fueled him to want to bring social change. And he actually got a law degree, which I don't think a lot of people realize. He got a law degree and he wanted to make a change and a difference in this world. Unfortunately, after he played in the NBA, he got into a lot of legal trouble because there was something with his license was expired, or suspended, something like to do with that, and he was practicing law without a license, so he got in a lot of trouble. Uh, but he was really good at finding ways to make money off of the court. He earned close to 20,000 a year with the Pistons, but despite that, he was still making money while being a lawyer off of the court. But he took on a lot of I want to say like civil rights issues during that time. So I don't want this video to make it look like he was all bad when I talk about his sporadic behavior. He was a good guy. Um, but he had other things on his mind. He said, this is a quote from him. "I like the game," he said simply, "even though I'm busy with outside activities. They actually come second at this point. When you're an athlete, you instinctively know you won't go on forever. So I can't make out the most out of basketball now, while I can and still play and enjoy it. The other activities I'll have more time for later." Uh, Maybe that's another factor why he retired at the age of 32. Like I know guys like Bob Pettit retired pretty early back then too to focus on their careers. Because like I said, the NBA wasn't as um, what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't as stable as it is now. The players today are set for life. Unfortunately, his life after basketball, like I said, he ran into a lot of legal trouble. He lost his legal license. And on March 14, 2001, he was found dead in his apartment in Detroit, Michigan. According to a police spokesperson, he had been dead for about a month, and the body was found. He died of natural causes at the age of 70. So why isn't he in the Hall of Fame? I mean, he had a great college career, great defensive player. Yes, he wasn't the best NBA player, but he did make 2 All-Star appearances. Uh, I mean, there are guys that are worse than him that are in the Hall of Fame. I don't get it. I mean, yeah, he's not a first ballot Hall of Famer. I get it in that aspect, but you think eventually he should have been inducted into the Hall of Fame. He did, like I said, it might have been his reputation that kept him out of the NBA, but there are guys who have worse reputations too that have made the NBA. So I don't know. But anyways, he had 1,593 fouls and fouled out 95 times in his career. His career averages are 10.4 points, 11.3 rebounds. If you want the totals, he had 6,223 career rebounds, 5,765 career points. In my opinion, in the late 50s, early 60s, trying to think where to rank him among centers because there were so many good centers back then. I would put him like top 5, I want to say, because obviously you'd have Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain 1 and 2. Whoever you put above each other, that's up to you to decide. Number 3 during that time, I'd put Walt Bellamy. Let's see. Number 4, it's tough, man. But I think I'd go with Dolph Schayes at number 4. He was, well, I guess you could say, make an argument he was more of a power forward because he played power forward and center. I'll put Dukes at number 4. He's above Ray Felix. You know, he's above other players in that time. Yeah, I'll put him at number 4. So let me know what your thoughts are down below. Does Walter Dukes deserve to be in the Hall of Fame? Where do you rank him all time? Let me know any of your thoughts. Thanks for watching.